There is a famous spiritual tradition that many have misinterpreted and misunderstood due to a spiritual practice that has become popular among so-called spiritual teachers. What is this spiritual tradition and practice? Let's find out. When we look at the ancient Indian schools of non-dualism, we cannot look past Advaita Vedanta. And Advaita Vedanta has become very popular in the modern world due to Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. And Ramana was my first gateway into Advaita Vedanta as well. And over time, due to having this tradition go to the West, there has become kind of a copy of this tradition, which a lot of people refer to as NeoAdvaita or NeoAdvaita Vedanta. Or you could say NeoAdvaita minus the Vedanta. And so a lot of people think that Advaita is something that you can study and learn minus Vedanta. Now, when we talk about Vedanta, what are we talking about? We're talking about the study of the Prasthana Trahi. So the three texts that make up the Prasthana Trahi, which are the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras. These are essential in understanding Advaita. And on top of this, you need to also study the Nididhyasana texts. Some of those are Ashtavakra Gita, the Avadhuta Gita, and the Mandukya Upanishad Kataka. Now, a lot of these texts are not studied with so-called Advaita students, especially when we talk about the West, right? And one of the problems with NeoAdvaita is that the fundamentals of Vedanta are ignored. And so you might see a lot of people who say that they study Advaita under a certain spiritual teacher, but all you're learning is a practice that became popular through Ramana Maharshi. And this is a fundamental flaw because NeoAdvaita itself is based all on Atma Vichara. Now, Atma Vichara means self-inquiry, inquiring into your own true nature. Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi said that we need to focus on the who am I when we talk about Atma Vichara, but the more accurate description is the what am I, because who implies that there's a person, right? And so when you go into the non-dual knowledge, Atman, the undifferentiated consciousness that you are, is identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality. And so if we were to say, who am I, then we are really talking about the jiva, the ego persona system. And unfortunately, a lot of this is not even taught by so-called Neo-Advaita teachers because we only should focus on the who am I. Everything is reduced to the inquiry, and this is completely against Advaita Vedanta and the study of Brahma Vidya. Now, Brahma Vidya means the knowledge of Brahman, or the knower of Brahman, the ultimate reality. And so what you find within Neo-Advaita circles and also with Neo-Advaita teachers in general is that all they do is they focus on the inquiry. Now, why this is a fundamental flaw and why this is a misinterpretation and how a lot of people have misunderstood Advaita non-dualism is because when people used to go and sit with Ramana Maharshi, they would ask him, how do we attain the silence and the splendor that you have embodied? How do we abide in the Atman, the undifferentiated consciousness? How do we abide in that? Because that's where that silence is emanating from in Ramana, right? He is abiding in the Atman. He is one with Brahman. And so people would ask Bhagavan about this. How do we embody that? How do we attain Atman? And so attaining Atman is paradoxical, right? Because you're already that. And so Ramana would have trouble trying to language these certain things to some of the people in the Sangha and the people who would come and visit him. And so he would have a preliminary stage to kind of till the soil in your mind so that you could get to a level where you start to feel the Atman, you start to abide in that undifferentiated consciousness. And that preliminary stage was Atma Vichara, was self-inquiry. And so he would give this practice for people to bring their awareness back into who is the one that is acting, who is the thinker of thoughts and the doer of actions. But Ramana didn't practice Atma Vichara because he was already the self. There was no practice needed. Again, this is a preliminary stage. And for those people who couldn't understand his silence. And so he gave Atma Vichara. And so do you see the problem here? NeoAdvaita focuses on the preliminary stage, and that's all there is. There's only the preliminary stage. You remain in the inquiry forever. And what do you see when you see even the spiritual teachers, the NeoAdvaita spiritual teachers and the people in the Sangha? They never advance to any great level, or they get to a stage where it's completely empty and void, but they're not in the splendor that the great sages were in. And so what ends up happening? You just sit there and you're constantly in the inquiry. Who is the one that thinks this? Who is the one that thinks this? Who is the one that likes pizza? Who is the one that likes to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night? You know, it gets a bit nutty, right? The inquiry is superimposed onto everything. When the inquiry was intentionally for the ego itself, it wasn't about your sensibilities towards the world. Like if you like pizza, for example, you don't sit around and analytically think about why you like pizza. That is a crazy person. And that is what happens within NeoAdvaita circles, because it becomes hyper analytical, and then you have no chance then of abiding in the Atman. You have no chance because you're constantly questioning yourself and creating this artificial split which doesn't exist. And Ramana would say it doesn't exist because you're already the Atman. You just need awareness of the jiva that you've become during this world. You've endured a socialization process like we all have, and you've become this person in air quotes, but you need to have awareness of this person in air quotes. And the more you have awareness of that person in air quotes, then you start to resonate and abide more in your true undifferentiated state of Atman. And that's the purpose of Atma Vicharya, is to have that awareness of the jiva, so that you can start to thin those layers away, so then that you become one with the Atman. The problem is within the NeoAdvaita circles is you remain in the inquiry forever, even in the ultimate state, because of this anxiety that the ego is going to continue to surface. And the ego will continue to surface, but the difference is if you're someone like Ramana Maharshi, you have a distance and you can see it and it doesn't bother you, and you don't act out of the motives that that ego is driven by. But the problem is within the NeoAdvaita circles is that they're always in the inquiry. Even if they get to a stage of the Atman, then they'll always still remain in the inquiry because the ego will continue to come back into their life. And then you just turn what is a beautiful tradition in Advaita Vedanta and you reduce it to one spiritual practice and you make it hyper-analytical. And look, many people who follow certain NeoAdvaita teachers and follow NeoAdvaita themselves will disagree because they are caught in that bind, because they don't know the splendor of the Brahma Vidya, of the knowledge of Brahman. So when you study Advaita Vedanta, what is the highest? The Brahma Vidya. You need to understand the knowledge of Brahman. And so how do we understand it? As I mentioned earlier, well, you have to study the Prasthana Trahi, and then you have to advance into studying Nididhyasana texts. And so some of the NeoAdvaita teachers in the world have not even studied the Brahma Vidya. And so if you haven't studied the Brahma Vidya, there's nothing that you can pass on. Some of them don't even have a curiosity in the Brahma Vidya because they're under this egotistical perspective that they're already enlightened. And so this is why you don't get any great results in a lot of those sanghas, because none of them are focused on the Brahma Vidya. They're not focused on the knowledge of Brahman. And so you're stuck in then this spiritual self-help loop where you're constantly in the inquiry, going around and around and around, going to the Sangha every day, hearing this same thing over and over and over again on repeat, but you don't advance on the path. It might be good for that moment within the satsang, but you can't take it out into your life because you have not learned the core of Advaita Vedanta, which is the Brahma Vidya. You need to focus on the Brahma Vidya. And this is one of the big problems when Advaita Vedanta went west, because when it went west, it was reduced to the inquiry, reduced to an analytical perspective of meditation, where we sit there and we focus on the who am I, who am I, and who am I. And it was stripped of all of its tradition, stripped of all of Vedanta. And that's where the problems occur. And this is why it's very important to learn under a Swami within a Vedanta tradition, or under a guru who has actually gone through the process of understanding the Brahma Vidya. Not just a person who teaches strictly the inquiry, but they have more to offer. They can explain more of the Brahma Vidya to you, which then can help you understand the depth of what you are experiencing within your practice, no matter whether it's Atmavacharya or any other sort of spiritual practice. But if you're so caught just in the inquiry, then it becomes pretty nutty at a certain level, because what do we find? We find that that person can't progress because they haven't been given the Brahma Vidya. And I've seen this all around the world. I spend a lot of time in spiritual places around the world, converse with spiritual aspirants, and even online here with you guys watching. And there is always this problem of that the individual can't progress on the path because they're stuck in this inquiry. I get emails all the time about this from students who are following a certain NeoAdvaita teacher and they can't progress. And so it ends up an analytical exercise that makes someone, in some sense, crazy. And you've heard all sorts of terrible stories that have come out from certain sanghas around the world, right, who follow NeoAdvaita and all they do is follow the inquiry. You've heard stories of people who go completely mad, and even worse than that, but I won't mention it here. And so it's all because the great tradition has been reduced to this one spiritual practice within that tradition, and under the belief that that's what it is, right? And the West do this all the time. They did this with yoga, right? Where when yoga went West, yoga was reduced to asanas. And so when people think of yoga now in the West, what they think of is asanas. They think of postures. They don't think of the great yogic tradition, which is not just asanas. There is a lot within the yogic tradition. And you don't even have to practice asanas to be a yogi. And that's something that's probably mind-boggling for a lot of people in the West. So if you want to really understand the tradition, you have to understand the Brahma Vidya. You have to put the time and effort into understanding these great texts. You have to have a combination of meditative contemplation, but also the study of the scriptures. They go hand in hand. There is no way around this, because you are learning from the great masters before you. You are learning from Shankara, from Gaudapada. You are learning from Vyasa. You are learning this great knowledge, and it's leading you down the path. These are the guides on your path when you follow the non-dual tradition. And so if you are going to follow a NeoAdvaita teacher, for example, it's probably better to understand the Brahma Vidya first before you get involved with some sort of sangha like that. Because if they're not teaching the Brahma Vidya, you're going to end up lost like a lot of people do. And then a lot of people then cling to the so-called guru and never leave the sangha. And that's not the point of understanding the Brahma Vidya. It's so that it liberates you to live your own life according to how the energy expresses itself through you, but you are a knower of Brahman. You understand the true ultimate reality of your existence, which is Brahman. And so that's what is important. And so to conclude all of this, it's very important to not get stuck in this spiritual self-help loop that a lot of people find themselves in, and instead get into some true and real sadhana. Get the scriptures, spend some time away from society, from your familiar surroundings and even the people that you know, and go deeper into this. This is what sadhana is. And that is a big problem with the NeoAdvaita circle, because they're stuck in this spiritual self-help loop. They don't really undergo any true sadhana. They don't merge their mind into these texts that are guiding them down the path. Instead, they're just sitting there in the inquiry, and then you just mute all day. But the thing is that you can be as spatial as you want in your own consciousness. But the problem is that that space within consciousness that a lot of people believe they experience within NeoAdvaita is just completely null and void, just empty blankness. And none of the ananda arises, the bliss, the true bliss, because that comes from understanding the depth of what you are doing in your sadhana. And so if Atmavacharya is part of your sadhana, right, you need to realize that you need to go go beyond that as well, right? Because this is a preliminary stage. And so the ultimate stage is to get to the level of the Brahma Vidya, which means that you will abide in the Atman, which is identical with Brahman. And so, as I said, you just need to be very, very careful about who you learn Advaita Vedanta from, and if the teacher and the group in general are actually studying the Brahma Vidya. Because if they're not studying the Brahma Vidya, then you will end up in a spiritual cul-de-sac, because all you are attached to is a spiritual practice that Ramana Maharshi advised us to use as a preliminary practice to understand the ultimate nature, that Atman, which you truly are, is the ultimate reality of Brahman. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.